friends. Welcome to the Recover Your Life podcast. My name is Bridgett, and I will be your host. Together, we are building a community of men and women who are learning to shift from a rule-based to a value-based approach in navigating faith, sexuality, and relationships. It's time to start living the life we long for. Let's dive in. Hi, friend. Welcome to the Recover Your Life podcast. I am so glad that you're here hanging out with the Recover Your Life homies. We're in for a treat. Cheyanne, thank you so much for hanging out with us.
Thanks so much for having me, friend. It's so special to get to join in. Thanks for having me.
Today's conversation, we're going to talk a lot about our purpose, which feels like one of those big, sparkly, Christianese statements of, live your purpose, all that kind of stuff. But we want to make it really practical and also help with the misunderstandings of what that means. I know in our times together off microphone, I just always leave feeling really clear, but without in a rush that everything has to get figured out. We're able to process and pray and say, these are all the things I'm dreaming of, and these are the things that my heart's really breaking over. And there's just a lot of space for both. And so thank you for the space that you've held for me in my story, and excited to be able to share that same space with our listeners today.
Yeah, thank you. I can say ditto to all of that. I always leave our conversations feeling very grounded, a sense of peace, sense of excitement, while also being able to hold reality in front of us and stare it in the face and still hold hope at the same time, which is such a gift. So you definitely carry that. And I'm sure your community has experienced that numerous times. So I just get to jump in and join in and say, yeah, me too.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, before we dive in, would you be willing to just share a little glimpse into your story? Who are you? What do you do? What is the thing that keeps you up at night that you want to fill the world with goodness? Tell us a little bit about Cheyanne.
Oh, such a good question. Yeah, I am involved in a next gen ministry alongside my husband. It's his full-time gig. But when your spouse is in full-time ministry, you are also somewhat in full-time ministry.
Yes.
And so we get to come alongside next-gen Christian leaders who are leading in really high-capacity ways, both within the church through either direct church ministry or parachurch ministries. But we also really focus on Christian leaders who are leading out in different spheres of culture. And so that has been really sweet, figuring out how Christians who are leading in arts and entertainment, or in politics, or in education, or online influencing and content creating, pro athletes, all different sorts of expressions of vocation, and figuring out how do we help equip them and connect them so that they can run their race really well. And so that's a part of kind of my story, my wiring, where God has brought me into the fold on that mix. My husband and I are also a part of a church plant here in Nashville, Tennessee, Way Church. Just celebrated our 1-year anniversary. And that's been really fun to come alongside a couple of our really dear friends, Noah and Maddie Heron and Connor and Vic Crumpton, to just see and be a small part of what God is doing here in Nashville. Mine and Grant's titles are intentionally vague. We are the directors of culture.
Absolutely. Love it.
As different as Grant and I are, we both care a lot about how we create space for magic to happen. And so on his end, he tends to do that at a very meta level. On my end, I love doing that in one-on-one conversations, in intentional small groups, in the way that we set a tone for a room. And so that has been a really sweet kind of expression of some of the broader core constructs and pieces of my own heart. And the main expression that I get to really activate and live out what I believe is my calling and purpose is as a life plan guide. It's through an organization called Paterson Center. It's actually been around for over 50 years, and they've helped thousands of individuals over those 50 plus years really get clear by looking at their story, their wiring, how God has shaped them, the way that He's gifted them, get really clear on what is their purpose and calling, and then how do they live it out in all the main areas of life, their personal life, their family life, their vocation, knowing that we spend half of our waking hours at work and we were created to do good works. And so how does that show up there, rightfully so, in a right-sized way? And then also community, whether that's your faith community, your local community, your physical, literal neighbors around you, friends gathering at your dinner table, whatever that looks like. And so I got to go through that experience not too long ago when I had my own kind of vocational crossroads of sorts, is really trying to discern, okay, I know enough about who I am and how I'm wired,
Yeah.
pretty introspective, borderline obsessed with personality assessments. I think you and I off
I
camera
hear
have
that.
just like deep dived in some of our favorite, and I could go there for hours.
Mm,
Um, so it felt like I had a lot of pieces of the puzzle as to like how
yeah.
God had made me and what some of my natural gifts and strengths and stuff were, but I really wasn't sure how all of those things fit together in like a cohesive, integrated way. And then also
Hmm.
like how does story play into it? Because I believe very much in,
Yes.
the verse that talks about like, and we are the clay in the potter's hands, and
Hmm.
how God uses all things for his glory and our good. And so how has God
Yeah.
also used my life experiences, and how has he been working through my story, whether it's something he brought into my life or something
Hmm.
that he has simply used to shape me and mold me.
Yeah.
And this beautiful life plan intensive really brought all of those things together for me in a
Mm,
truly adhering and cohesive and
yeah.
integrated way, in ways that other things just hadn't quite pulled all the strings together yet. And so
Yeah.
coming out of that, I realized, man, I feel very called to this work. And so I began
Mm,
the process of getting certified, franchising, getting trained, and all the things, and becoming a life
hmm.
plan guide. And so now that's what I get to do. And it really is my heart to just help unlock and unleash leaders in their calling so that they can make
Mm,
their impact on the world and finish well. I think that's a really big
yeah.
part of my heart, is I want to see this um, done where we are walking in the manner worthy of our calling, as Ephesians 4
Yeah.
talks about. That we do this with Jesus and at a pace that he modeled, and we just never saw him in a hurry. He was extremely efficient and proficient. He
Hmm.
was never in a rush. He was never in a hurry.
Yeah.
So how do we
Mm,
model that in light of how he's made us, and live a life that is full of purpose and intent, um,
yeah.
and aligns with who he made us to be? It's not some high in the
Hmm.
sky weird thing that I
Hmm.
kind of have to form and shape and like try to squish myself into some sort of mold. We
Hmm.
just get to uncover the intentionality of God and how he's
Hmm.
made his children, and what
Yeah.
that might mean for what he has for us.
That's so good. I have so many thoughts in my head, so many different directions. But one of the things it reminds me of is my favorite quote by Caroline Leaf that says, "Your purpose is not what you do, it's what happens in others when you do what you do."
Yes. Oh, that's so good. That's so
And I
good.
know for me, a lot of my youth group experience around the conversation of calling and purpose was kind of this fear monger. What happens when you get to heaven and you were a doctor your whole life and you were supposed to be a farmer? Or, you were a teacher and you were supposed to be a missionary, or, so it's very this high intense, like, what college is God calling you to? All, whatever, whatever. And so there definitely was some recovering that I know I had to do in my own story as a young college student, to say, hey, there are places and things that I come alive in that don't quite fit the box that this conversation has provided for me. I don't really know what to do with that. I always like to tell people is like, pay attention to the places where you come alive. And I wish I
Mm,
had scientific, like, this is how you come alive, but as more as you can watch it in someone's face when they show up with themselves fully present, and when they're just getting through the day, getting stuff done, or even like hiding part of themselves. And
mm.
so I guess a question for you, as you've navigated this conversation around, again, these very heavily, I'm going to call them heavily historied Christian words, calling and purpose.
Yeah.
What has that looked like for you, and how have you, in your own work, been able to help people see that calling and purpose is not a single one box, one line, but it's a bigger conversation?
Yes. Oh, friend, such a thoughtful question, and I resonate so much with your story. As someone who grew up in a small town Texas, non-denominational with some Baptist uh,
Mm-hmm.
underpinnings, church that was so beautiful and truly gifted me
Mm-hmm.
with so much. I can definitely see how, especially I think for our generation growing up in
Yeah.
this, I remember when Rick Warren released the book, The Purpose-Driven Life, and how
Yeah.
beautiful and impactful it was. And
Absolutely.
it really began this conversation in the church around purpose, which I think the
Mm-hmm.
church should be talking about that. That is,
Yeah.
when we're connected to scripture and we look at God's intentionality and we see the story he's been writing for hundreds, thousands of
Mm-hmm.
years, we see how he has unique purpose for his people. So I think it's a very pure and very worthy topic, and also recognize that some of it has maybe not been quite right sized.
Yeah.
Maybe some pieces were a little too emphasized, while others not emphasized enough. And what
Mm-hmm.
was really helpful for me, as I was doing some of my own work and unpacking calling and purpose, was realizing that there are almost levels of that.
Yeah.
I remember the co-founder of Paterson Center, which is where LifePlan comes out of and was created. He was doing a teaching one time, and he explained, he said, um, as people who have surrendered their lives to Jesus and have committed to following him and doing life his way to the best of their abilities, he's like, we all share the same meta purpose: to live, love, and lead like Jesus would if he
Mm-hmm.
were us. We all
Yeah.
share that common purpose. It's the if he were us piece that we can begin to kind of drill down a little deeper into, though.
Yeah.
Because
Good.
when we look back in Genesis, it's so curious to me how it says God created male and female in his image. So, right from the start, we immediately see differentiation. We
Mm-hmm.
see the uniqueness. We see how God didn't just create a duplicate of what he had already
Yes.
created, he made something different. And so, if
Mm-hmm.
we're all then made in the image and likeness of our Father, but we all look so different,
Mm-hmm.
what does that mean?
Yeah.
What's the intent of that? What's the purpose? What's God's
Mm-hmm.
purpose and his good plan behind it?
Yeah.
And where I'm at in my own kind of perspective of it is like, I really believe that God has put a unique piece of his
Mm-hmm.
heart in each of us to reflect back to the world, to show up as his hands and feet, and reflection of him to the world so that it points others to him. But we're going to hold very unique different parts of what that looks like. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I think there's kind of a general sentiment in our culture today that I believe is really beautiful, Christian and non-Christian alike, that people
Yeah.
have inherent value, people have inherent purpose. When you
Mm-hmm.
then layer in on top of that kind of the core Christian beliefs of like, okay,
Yeah.
I double down on that even more. It's now, I no longer have value as a human, of course, but
Mm-hmm.
God, I'm recognizing and owning and surrendering my life to this idea that God has specific plans for me.
Yeah.
And so it can become really easy, or at least it was for me, to get almost hyper fixated and
Mm-hmm.
a little bit it just kind of like constantly circling, constantly chewing, to a point of it was showing up in a lot of anxiety for me,
Yeah.
especially in the spaces that I was running in with a lot of beautiful, brilliant, very type A leaders who felt very clear on what it was that God had for them. And although I knew different pieces of and elements of how God had created me, as I talked about a minute ago, I didn't, I couldn't clearly articulate my calling. And
Yeah.
that was a very tender, very
Mm-hmm.
raw spot of my heart, because it felt like within this Christian context, there was so much almost pressure around
Yeah.
it. And I just, when I try to sit and imagine what it might be like for God to look down on us
Mm-hmm.
and see that, I just don't think that's what he sees.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think he sees you've got it or you don't got it. I think his question
Yep.
is, are you with me and looking for me? Because I'm with you and looking for you. And
Mm-hmm.
so I just think that little perspective shift was really helpful in my own way of thinking about calling and purpose. Um, I also recognize that there can be different vehicles in different seasons. Like what
Correct.
God has, quote unquote, called us to today
Mm-hmm.
may not be for forever, and that's okay.
Yeah.
But it will
Mhm.
always, to a certain degree, fit who we are. I was reading through Matthew 11 this morning, and Jesus is talking about, come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden, I will give you rest for your souls. My burden is easy and my yoke is light. And what's interesting
Mhm.
is when you look back historically and contextually, obviously oxen were often used to help kind of plow and till the land, and
Mm.
obviously super important in that day and age. But um, the farmer would always take the piece of wood that served
Yep.
as that weight bearer on them, and they
Mhm.
would handcraft it so that would fit each specific ox, because they
Mhm.
recognized the weight of the work is heavy enough. I don't need
Yeah.
to create unnecessary rub, unnecessary tension,
Mhm.
unnecessary pressure. And I just thought that that was a really beautiful picture and even descriptor that Jesus used to
Yeah.
describe the kind of work that he would have for us.
Yep.
It was often beautiful too, because as I was doing a little bit more research on it, they often would pair the ox. So it was never
Mhm.
one ox by himself, it was always paired
Yep.
with another. And there was almost
Mm.
always one of the ox that was more strong than the other. And the
Mhm.
farmer would actually uh, kind of change the system just enough to where that stronger ox took a majority of that weight.
Mm.
And I see that as Jesus for us. It's like we're
Mhm.
alongside him in the pull of whatever it is that his invitation is for us in each season. But at the end of the day, like, he is doing the heavy lifting. Doesn't mean we won't feel
Mhm.
it. It doesn't mean it won't be hard sometimes. It doesn't mean we won't feel exhausted and overwhelmed in times either. It just means we won't ever be alone. The weight won't
Yeah.
be fully ours to bear. So, a
Mhm.
few of my thoughts and musings on your very thoughtful question around
Mm.
purpose
I
and
love that.
calling in a Christian context. So, thanks for
Yeah.
asking it.
Um, do you know that Matthew 11 is why I named it Recover Your Life podcast?
I did not.
So in the Message translation of that, the end of that passage in 11:28, it says, "Are you tired, worn out, burned out on religion? Come to me, get away with me, and you'll recover your life." And it came from my own season of being a pastor in full-time ministry and having some pretty big life dreams shatter into a zillion pieces, and going, "Hey, you said if I'd come away, you'd recover me." Because I don't know if Bridget's ever coming back again. Like I remember sitting around lunch tables with my co-pastors and saying, "Yeah, there's a part of Bridget that died and I just don't know if she's ever coming back again. But if Jesus is really sure that his resurrection life is real, then that means there has to be resurrection for me." Like, and I don't know when it's coming back, but I'm just going to keep believing that she's going to come back to life. And I remember that season, there were so many times where I'd get a picture in my head of like just sitting at a tombstone with God, and we would just change out the flowers, and I'd come and I'd weep and I'd scream and I'd yell and all the things of like, "God, I just don't understand why this dream died." It was so kind of God. Like I remember being so angry. I was with my counselor one day and I was just like, I'm so mad that Jesus isn't saying anything when I go scream. And she's like, "Okay." She's like, "Well, why don't you just tell Papa about that?" And so I'm like, "Okay, God, like, I'm really angry that Jesus is not saying anything to me." And Jesus just sits with tears in his eyes. And I'm like, "Okay." I want to have my heart feel really hard and mad, but I feel really soft. I'm like, "Oh, what's happening?" And I just remember there was this moment where God was like, "Hey, I refuse." He's like, "Everything I would say to you right now would be truth." Like, he's like, "You know that, I know that. Everything I say to you right now would be 100% true. Um, but I refuse to make a point to and dishonor your pain.
Mm.
Like, I refuse to make this about me being right. I want to be with you." Like that whole thing of, in this world, you're going to have trouble. And I'm going to I overcome the world, and thinking about, the whole thing about being equally yoked and what that looks like to live in purpose of, I felt so good because so much of that season for me was burying the box that I thought my purpose was going to come in. And also saying, okay, what if this was never meant to be a box in the first place? And so what do we build now? Where do we go now? What do we do? And what things still bring Bridgett life?
Mm.
And that was really helpful, just to be able to say, okay, cool. Now we're in a zone to go, I really like sitting with people when we're grieving, right? I'm sitting here screaming at Jesus, but actually I really like knowing the God who grieves, and I like sitting with people in grief. And I've been sitting here spending hours and hours reading books on healthy sexuality, and that feels like a topic that those are the whispered conversations that my friends are having with me, or, people in my church are having with me of like, oh, I'm not sure if we're allowed to talk about this, but I want to. And so all these little things just started popping up of like, okay, well, what if we're not, I talked about this recently on a podcast I did with our somatic coach friend, Wendy Nelson, who we've had on the podcast a couple times. And we said, sometimes in life, we come to a point where we feel like we're abandoning the vision, but we're actually just abandoning the strategy that no longer serves us in this season.
That's good.
And so you mentioned that idea of, sometimes it is a season thing. For me, I kind of like to use these 3 words. I think they're helpful in understanding calling. I think God gives us callings for moments, for ministries, and for mantles. And so I think there are some moments where it's like, there's just grace on this right now. Say yes. It's a fun, wild adventure. I think there are longer seasons where God says, no, I'm actually going to give grace to fulfill a ministry purpose, whether that's in alignment with an official quote unquote ministry, or if it's a job career or a season of life in your family, or a specific time in your life that just, it needs a certain direction that God's asking you. And then I do think we do have those deep internal workings. It's like, no matter where you go, no matter how old you get, no matter what happens in life, there's some things that always, just when you feel them, when you engage them, they do bring you to life. And so it's just kind of, it's taking the out of the boxness. And that's what I just really appreciate about kind of what you carry, is this peace and pressure removing of having it all figured out.
Yeah. That's so powerful. I love your language around the moments, the ministry, the mantle, because I think that gives so much helpful framework and an appropriate level of even commitment for us to even process and think through, well, I'm at this job, or I'm in this position, or I'm in this season because God called me to it. And it's like, that can be true. And it could, I'm not saying it is, but it could also be true that that's no longer where the grace is. Had a lot of conversations with friends lately, just talking about when God has called you to something or in something, that there's just almost this natural grace that covers it. And a recent, very clear time where I felt that grace covering was my husband's youngest brother and his 2 kids lived with us for the past 2 years. And friends would always ask, they'd be like, man, y'all just have a lot going on. And the kids, I'm sure they're so fun. And that's so different from just you and your husband living together. Like, well, how are y'all doing? That must be so hard. And it was always so kind that they would recognize those things, almost to a point where I felt guilty. And I was like, it's not that there aren't challenges, but it doesn't feel like it's as hard as it maybe should be or even could be. And towards the last couple of months of that 2-year stint and that 2-year season with us, I started noticing, I was like, okay, why does this feel harder all of a sudden? Like, why do I feel more easily irritated? Why do I feel like these things that have never bothered me and bugged me at this, extent before, like all of a sudden it feels more near to the surface. And it was in a conversation with a friend. They were like, it's because the grace is lifting, because the season's coming to an end. And just being able to not only mentally or even theologically understand that, but to viscerally feel that was like, oh, that this is a very real thing. This is a very real thing. And as I paid attention to that feeling, I was like, and there have clearly been other times, whether it was in other seasons with family or seasons, especially within roles and job positions, where I'd also experienced that. So I love that
Mhm.
your framework gives a sense of nod and reference and framework for uh, what someone might be experiencing, whether it's, this is a moment that God has me in, this is a ministry
Mhm.
that's maybe a bit of a longer season, or this really is like the mantle that I feel like is just, it's kind of God's
Yeah.
fingerprint on me, and that will always be there
Mm.
and will always have some sort of expression, even though the expression may change. So that's really
Mm.
beautiful, my friend.
I love that. I recently invited myself over, which was one of my spiritual gifts. I invited myself over for dinner to older couple's house, and it was so sweet. And just having lived so much of life, I asked, one of the things I asked the husband, I was like, hey, he's had all these different careers. I'm like, okay, like what's the thread through them all?
Mm,
And he was like, oh, wow, I don't know if I've thought about that. And he went through all the different, in some ways, like very different jobs, like very different companies, very different skill sets. Um, and it was just really cool to watch the way that God kind of wove them all together and has built a really beautiful life with all of these skills from all of these different decades of different employment from all over, all the different places they've lived and what that's looked like for them. And for me, it's really interesting, I think, about from a culture perspective on this topic is the positioning of the conversation around purpose feels so radically different depending on which generation you're talking to, right? I feel like for older generations, in a way, and just to even acknowledge our own privilege of that, for some people in the context of their story, like the idea of pursuing a career out of purpose and vision and not out of necessity is a privilege. The
absolutely.
ease of that. Not saying that everyone doesn't have access to it, but the ease of access to being able to live like that does have something, and so, even just the generational of like, well, my dad was a lawyer, and so I'm a lawyer, and so whatever. And then maybe kind of even the cultural shift way to the other side of that narrative is now we're seeing Gen Z with maybe like this idea of too many options of like, oh my gosh, like, am I supposed to have a million subscribers on YouTube? And am I supposed to like, I don't want to do anything unless it's my purpose. And, I don't want to, the idea I think that I hear people say is like, oh, well, they don't want to work hard, which isn't true, right? The culture perspective that we see on both age gaps are not 100% accurate, but there is some reality to the cultural context within those generations. And I'm curious for you, as a life plan guide and just as you have been in leadership of humans, what's been the generational difference that you're seeing in this conversation around purpose?
Oh, well, I definitely feel like your sense of it is spot on from what I feel like I've been seeing, um, both in conversations just with friends and around dinner tables, as well as
Mhm.
specifically and especially in the conversations that I have with clients during our life plan intensives. I've had, the privilege of working with clients ranging from ages 19 to 50. And so it's
Mhm.
been really fun to see different seasons of life and the different kinds of,
Mhm.
not only the kinds of questions, but the tone even around
Yeah.
the questions that they're really bringing to the table that we're spending that
Yeah.
time really trying to unpack and bring some clarity and direction to. And here's what I've noticed. It's been really interesting. My older clients, those who, and I love that you gave the nod to, it's almost this like purpose versus provision. Like both
Yeah.
are so important. It's when one becomes a little bit more outsized than the other
Yeah.
that things can get a bit wonky, but both are important.
Mhm.
And it has felt like for the majority of my older clients, they believe that they have a purpose, but it's almost like there's still a question mark at the end of it. It's not, I believe I have purpose. It's,
Yeah.
I believe I have purpose. And it's
Mhm.
this hopeful, but somewhat timid and doubtful reaction to this notion. And I actually think going back to, Rick Warren's, massively popular book, Purpose Driven
Yeah.
Life, I think that's why that book was so
For sure.
empowering and impactful for that generation. Because I don't know if
Mhm.
that was, the context or the conversation for them growing up. And so, so grateful for how that just has maybe helped unlock and unleash some people within that generation. But I still sense a hesitation and a lot of
Mhm.
question mark around it.
Mhm.
Whereas for my younger clients, Gen Z, even, younger millennials, uh, there's been an interesting shift. It's very subtle and no one has said it overtly. So this is my own kind of perspective, picking up
Yep.
on some subtle patterns of comparison has infiltrated purpose.
Yep.
Purpose and calling has become almost that new playground
Mhm.
for comparison, and not consciously, not because of intent, but because there is now a more common sentiment, which is so positive, that like,
Mhm.
yes, I do believe that I have a unique purpose, which is beautiful, and we
Mhm.
should totally celebrate that. I think that
Yeah.
is, I think, of my parents, and I think they would be so happy to know that, I don't wrestle with the question, do I have purpose? Maybe
Yeah.
in the same way that they did. And I think because of that, it's almost become this, okay, because I believe I have purpose, how does it stack rank against everyone else's? It's
Mhm.
this human innate thing in us of like,
Yeah.
I want to be seen, known, and loved. I want to feel special and unique.
For sure.
Because I think down at our core, we all know that in our DNA. But there's almost this like
Mhm.
slight little bend to it of like,
Mhm.
if we're not careful, it can very quickly, for me, it definitely had become like,
Yeah.
man, I feel so inferior, or I feel so maybe superior, or I feel like there's a sense of competition between me and my brothers and sisters. And where's that coming from? That feels kind of weird. And I don't want that, but like, what's the root of this
Yeah.
thing? And I really think purpose has almost become a very tempting playground for comparison for our
Mhm.
generation, Gen Z. I'm very curious to see kind of Gen Alpha's
Yep.
stance on it once they begin to hit, their high school years and eventually early 20s as well. But those are some
Mm.
of the very subtle, nuanced differences that I see between generations around the purpose conversation. And I think the approach, like, so as I'm guiding someone through this process, it's helpful for me because depending on where that person maybe is on that spectrum,
Yeah.
it's like, how do we help bring them closer to like a healthy
Mhm.
middle where it is
Yep.
the both and. And so for those who are on
Mhm.
this side where it's like, do I have a purpose? Man, the point that we hit in the life plan process where we bring all of the perspective that we've gleaned, all of the elements from their
Mhm.
story and their wiring, their core values, the natural gifts and talents and the heart that God's put in them. We bring all that to like a coalescence and we uncover, because we're not creating anything, we're truly uncovering what God has already put there around this little treasure hunt, which
Mhm.
is so fun. I love it. And that
Mhm.
moment when we get nailed down in 14 or 15 words, like this is
Yeah.
kind of, to borrow your language, this is the mantle, this is the
Mhm.
fingerprint, this is your unique purpose. And we'll
Mm.
have different
Love that.
expressions, but at your core, this is what we really are sensing. Man, that
Mm.
moment is so powerful for those clients
Mhm.
and encouraging them to really lean into it, encouraging them to root themselves in that, encouraging them to remind themselves
Mm.
that they were created as Christ's workmanship, intended for good works, and to stay
Mhm.
rooted in that. And for my clients who are maybe on this end of the spectrum, where it's, I know I have a purpose, and there's maybe a little bit of heightened sensitivity around it and sense of how it compares or stack ranks against the people around me.
Mm.
It's reminding them that as Christians, we're also called to surrender. It's this
Mhm.
like, you will never find your life until you've surrendered it. It's this upside down kingdom
Mhm.
principle that like doesn't make sense on its own. Yet when you try to practice it, it's like, hold on, why does this work? Oh yeah, I guess that was, God kind of gave us some hints about that. But it is this idea that, my purpose isn't just for me. My purpose
Yeah.
truly, like the quote you shared earlier from Dr. Leaf of, it is for others. My purpose,
Mhm.
I will feel fulfilled by, but ultimately it's not about me and it's not for me. I get to participate
Yeah.
and I'm a crucial element of that, and it will be food for my own soul, so I will benefit. But at the end of the
Yeah.
day, like we are vessels. It is the thing that is flowing through us to keep us from growing stagnant. You think about the
Mhm.
difference in lakes and rivers, as we were created to be a river of healthy flowing water that brings life and nourishment to the people and world around us. And so just
Yeah.
reminding, that there is a both and having emphasis on one versus the other can lead to maybe well-intended, but not helpful or healthy consequences. So your sense
Mhm.
of that and that difference generationally, I would say, is spot on.
Yeah, that's cool. One of the core questions I use with my clients is helping them navigate what's happening. So, what's happening inside of them, and maybe what might they be missing in the context around them that's leading to an intense emotional response. Not necessarily a bad emotional response, just it has a little extra energy or intensity to it. And so, like you said, like understanding the story of like, curious, when we talk about purpose, you go way to this side of the spectrum or way to this other side of the spectrum. And it's been interesting as I've been doing some dreaming for 2025 and some business goals that I have. And so I said, okay, I've brought some really core people that love me that don't really have business knowledge right into that conversation. And then I'm pulling in business leaders, like strangers from the internet that have successful companies that know nothing about Bridgett. And right, I'm getting lots of interesting perspective on Bridgett from the people that I
Mm,
invited to that table. And it was interesting. I was having a conversation with someone yesterday, and um, I just had to get to a place where I was like, "Hey, I understand that this is the path that you suggest, and I also acknowledge that that is not a path that I'm willing to take."
mm,
And so it's not that they're wrong. It's not that that's not the right path for them or for a bunch of other people, but to really say, yeah, like that is a way that I could build the dream. And it's not anything even inherently wrong with building it that way. But there was just something inside of me that went, that doesn't feel like me. I think it's the kind of the same idea of like when you get dressed sometimes, like there are some days where I'm like, I'm just running to groceries. It doesn't really matter. I don't really care if this looks like Bridgett. I'm just throwing on some clothes to go to the store. And then there are other times where like I'm going somewhere in a place where I value and I go, this doesn't look like me. Like this isn't
mm.
my style. This doesn't feel right. I want to go change and try something different. Um, where it's just kind of that innate, spirit knowing sense of it's a good thing. It's just not necessarily my thing, and that's okay for me to say that, but bravely.
Yeah, I love that. Where does that show up for you in your mind, your body, your heart when you hear a suggestion or something that's offered, piece of advice, especially when you've, invited them to the table? I love that language you used.
Mm.
Um, how do you know when something that's presented does or doesn't fit?
Um, w- when I can identify what the fear is that I have in it,
Mm,
um, because the way that the conversation went yesterday was kind of the, um, hey, that might be stunting your growth. I was like, oh, I hear you. I totally get that that could be. I also acknowledge that there are some other yeses that I've made outside of this suggestion that for me to follow this one forward, it means that um I kind of get small in some of those other areas,
mm,
and that didn't feel true. Like I
mhm,
feel like I wanted that partnership to say I want to come alive in the other yeses that I've made, and for me to do it this way meant I had to get small, which for me feels different than Grace leaving, because Grace leaving says um, you've outgrown. Like it's kind of the idea of sometimes you outgrow as your kids are growing, you outgrow clothes. It's like, okay, time for the next size of shoe. This felt like you need to make your foot smaller.
mm. It's a great
So I think
analogy.
I don't know if that works, but that's kind of how I
Yeah.
think about it.
Yeah. That's really helpful.
I would love to ask you some questions as far as, so people are listening to us. I think, you know, just the whole idea of, I do believe that everybody has had that moment, whether they've been able to articulate it or not. Something, I'm not really sure what's off right now, but something's off. I'm not really sure if this is the job I want to be in, if this is the relationship I want to be in, if this is the church I want to be in, right? It's just like something just feels funny and I can't really decide, like, is this me, something I need to work through and own and stay present in this place, or if this is something where I go, maybe it's not me, maybe what I am discerning is correct and it is time to make a shift in those outternal relationships. What's kind of a framework people can work through to say, I'm trying to figure out purpose, I'm kind of new to this conversation, but what can they take home with them this week and take some time and kind of walk through to begin this conversation if they haven't before?
Great question. The very first place that I usually start when I'm having conversations with friends, clients, who are in that kind of season where it's like things feel foggy for one reason or another, like you alluded to. There's 4 different questions that I'll usually kind of bring up and just encourage them to journal it out. Sometimes we'll talk it out. I think it's really helpful to write them because then you can visually see it. It's not just in your head. It's kind of getting it out of your head and onto paper. But the 4 questions, the first one is, what is right? So those are the things that you don't want to lose grip of. Those are the things that you want to cultivate, right?
Yeah.
And often they are the things that kind of naturally take the back burner, because the things that feel confusing or painful usually are what's at the forefront. And that's with good intent and good design. It means that those things need attention, but it also doesn't mean that we need to completely forsake the things or lose sight of the things that are going right. And so that is, I think, just a really helpful starting place of what is right in my life. You know, what relationships, what spaces are you showing up in? What specific things about your job or about what you're experiencing here in your local church or with this friend group or with how you and the Lord are interacting in this season? Like, what is right about all of that? And then once you've spent some really good time kind of thinking through that, coming up with a list around that, 3 other questions follow that really speak to more of those common pain points. The second is, what is wrong? And when I say wrong here, it could be in like an ethical sense, right? Like wrong in the sense of like right and wrong, good and bad. More often than not, it is also square peg and round hole. Like it's really something that needs to change. When we say something like what is wrong, we're really talking about like something that needs to change. Those are often the pain points of things that maybe don't feel like they fit. Or it feels like, hey, they're asking me to shrink my foot size, to borrow your well-put analogy from a few moments ago. I really love the picture, the imagery of that. It's just like picturing the scene in Cinderella where all the stepsisters are trying so hard to like fit their foot in the shoe. Yeah, that's what came to mind for me, which is a really sweet callback. So that's the second question. I'm really thinking through that, not just in whatever area feels loudest right now, because if you are in a season where, man, this job, I feel that I'm not appreciated, I'm not seen, I'm not getting to use my talents, my heart is so not in it, that is going to feel really loud. And it will be important to capture what feels wrong or what needs to change about that. But don't also miss other areas of your life too, those friendships where you're engaging in community, how you're growing and learning as a person, your relationship with God, your family, all of that. So really kind of thinking through those lenses for all of these questions is very helpful. The third question is, what is confused? These are things that need clarity. We need to clarify. So just write out the question. Literally, should have a question mark at the end. Like, what am I called to do in this season? How do I make sense of this relationship that was once really life-giving and now something's off? What does it mean for this particular, personal exercise or rhythm that I've been engaging in, and all of a sudden, like, it just is not, this isn't this, I don't understand what to do with this. Like, write out what
Yeah.
those questions are. And again, you don't have to solve anything right now, just capture them. And then the fourth question that I love asking is, what's missing? And a lot of times you'll find what's missing by going through those other three questions. Something that will often show up in the at first what is wrong category is like, I have no time for myself. Yes, it does need to change, but it's actually because something's missing. So capture it there. And those are things that you would want to add into your current life. And once you've got those things out on paper, maybe just sit with them with Jesus. Hold them before him and just say, is there anything that you would want to shed light on around any of these? See what comes up and comes to mind for you. In LifePlan, it's a very helpful understanding of like, where are you today? And where is it that we're going to then start moving in a direction through our next 2 days together? But that's an exercise and a set of questions that I personally pull out probably once a week to just brain dump for myself, to really process through something, to again get it all out of my head and onto paper. So that's what I would offer as some helpful starting points.
That's so good. Love it, love it. Well, before we end our time together, I would love to just kind of get people connected to you. Where do they find you? And if they're interested in booking a life plan intensive, is that what you call them?
Yes.
With you, how do they do that, and what can they expect during that time?
Yeah, great questions. If you want to follow along, Instagram is pretty much where I live. You can find me at Cheyanne Skeldon. My first name and last name are spelled uniquely, so I was able to get that handle.
I'll have them linked below.
Yeah, so that's it. And then you can also find more information about what a life plan is, what it hopes to accomplish, what you can expect to walk away from that 2-day intensive with on my website, CheyanneSkeldon.com. A few of those things, just super practically, is walking away with a sense of like a time budget. So in our lives, we're given two things. We are all given two things to steward and manage: time and energy. And so there are two particular exercises that are reusable and renewable throughout the life plan process that help you manage both your time and help you manage your energy, so that you're no longer a slave of your schedule, but you instead get to steward your schedule. And same thing with your energy. We know that as we are all pouring out and hopefully being vessels to others, if we don't have stuff coming in at the top, there's not going to be much to give out at the bottom. And so we get really specific, down, like very nitty gritty on like, what are those things? How often do you need those things? How much of those things do you need it? What's the rhythm around it? What are the multipliers where when you get this, it fills multiple different buckets? That's something else that's really helpful and insightful. We have a beautiful conversation around core values, the rules of the road. So like, you know, when you're on the highways, you know, and you maybe are a little sleepy, or you're texting and you're not supposed to, and you veer a little too far to the left or right and you hit those rumble strips. It's like, oh, things are getting a little shaky and kind of loud. Like that's what we mean when we say core values in this context. When you or someone else violates these things get loud, things get shaky. We get really clear on what those kind of top core ones are. We do a really fun exercise that helps. We go through a whole process, number of different clues to really pull out and cultivate. Like, what are your top core talents? Almost like the tools in your tool belt that you can whip out and use, yes, in your vocation, your job, but also in all of those other areas that we've been talking about throughout the episode. What are those unique talents? Because there's very small likelihood that anyone else would have that. And even if they did, it's not going to look the same way as what yours is. So we get really clear on what those are so you can steward them appropriately, as well as your heart. It's like, man, what is it that I naturally care about and dream about? Like, what do I hope is true about me at the end of my life? And all of this is backed in the process, going through her story, uncovering, you know, how my mind is wired, uncovering some of those core values. All of that speaks into it. So we're not just pulling, you know, rabbits out of hats. It's this beautiful process that really kind of builds on top of itself. So there's just a handful, to name a few. A lot more information on my website for those who are interested to find out more. Would love to connect with anyone who's just exploring it and wants to see if this is a good fit or not. I joke with friends, I'm like, I'm the least salesperson-y person I know.
Yeah.
I've had conversations where I'm like talking with friends, I'm like, yeah, you don't need a life plan right now.
Yeah.
Let's talk again later. Because I so firmly believe everyone could benefit from it. And like a farmer who has the wisdom and discernment to know you plant certain seeds in certain seasons so that you reap a maximum harvest. Life plan is that way too. So for anyone who's curious to explore it, would love to hop on just like a 30-minute Zoom call. No cost, just to have a conversation, share more, hear what you're asking, see what you're wrestling with, and to truly help discern if this could be a right next step for you.
So good. Well, friend, thank you so much for your time today and your wisdom, your kindness, and engaging this good story.
Oh, thank you, friend. Thanks for the space, for the intentionality, for your heart, sharing your own story. It's really sweet to be having a conversation we've had multiple times over coffee, but getting to do it now with some extended friends is really sweet. So thank you.
I'm so glad you could join us for today's conversation. Be sure to check out your show notes to learn more about today's guest, how you can connect with them, and other resources they have to support you in your journey to living the life you long for. If you're interested in booking a coaching session with me, you can book your free discovery call today by using the link in our show notes. Friend, your story is so worth sharing, and I hope that today you feel a little bit more supported in navigating conversations about faith, sexuality, and relationships. I would love to partner with you on this journey, so if there's anything you need from me, please don't ever hesitate to reach out. I can't wait to see you next time on the Recover Your Life podcast.